Hey everyone, I am here with Matthew Clair, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University and the author of Privilege and Punishment: How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court. And he also wrote this fascinating piece in The Nation, one of the best magazines in the country, but I'm sure you know that already, about how we end up with, or how we have ended up with, our current public defender system, which, as you laid out in the piece, has a rich history, but I'd love to talk to you about that. How are you, Matthew?
I'm doing all right. Doing as well as all of us are, I suppose, in this moment. Good to see you.
Exactly. Good to see you too. So let's talk about your piece, because what I think is so fascinating is how you connected the distrust of public defenders and the fact that a lot of people don't have warm and cozy feelings about the public defense system to a larger lack of faith in our criminal justice system and the prosecutorial system, how it's kind of all a part of a greater whole. But the origins of the public defender system are fascinating too. So just talk about the overarching theme of it being connected to the criminal justice system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, so, I'll say, many defendants, we sort of hear often this term of the public pretender, right, from people who are in the system and they're poor and they rely on public defenders for their representation. And sort of that indicates, that maybe these people who are supposed to be on my side and are representing me are actually pretending and are really colluding with government or DAs and, really think I'm guilty. And that indictment from defendants is really not an indictment necessarily of the specific lawyer or even really of sort of really believing that the lawyer is not on their side. It's more an indictment of the broader system and realizing the lack of resources that public defenders have, and also realizing that so much of the criminal court process and so much of them going through the process is about mitigating legal outcomes and just minimizing the impact of the process rather than actually helping people thrive and flourish as humans and even not even allowing for accountability for people that they may have harmed and recognize that they have harmed. And so people who go through the system as defendants are indicting not just their public defenders, but really the broader system as a whole.
Certainly. So let's talk then about the origins of public defenders. So it seems like in your piece you wrote about how in the 1890s progressive thinkers started talking about the idea of a public defender, and even more radical progressives or more forward-thinking progressives brought up this idea that would be seen as radical today, but I think is so fascinating, that everybody should be forced to use a public defender, almost eliminating the need for private law. I mean, I'm sure for corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, things like that, I guess, yeah, there is a place for that. But can you talk about those initial discussions and what they evolved to?
Yeah, so I just want to sort of first say that this piece is very much emerging from my reading of and review of Sarah Mayu's work and her book Free Justice, which is a fantastic book that I think everyone should pick up to really get a deep sense of the history of the emergence of the public defender. And for me, as someone who studies the contemporary way public defender systems work, it was a really profound insight that I was not aware of before reading the book. But so, yeah, in the progressive era, some people who were starting to think about maybe we should have, instead of this sort of patchwork system of voluntary lawyers who jump in and fly in, some who ask for ridiculous things like first extort people, but then also ask for sexual favors in return for just defending people. It was a really corrupt system.
Just quickly touching on that, that was a jarring part of your piece and what you wrote about the fact that Black defendants specifically back in those times, they were either lynched, victims of mob violence, or tortured into giving guilty pleas, which you talked about. But if they did have a lawyer, they were often extorted for a lot of money, or sexual favors were asked for in return for their services.
Right. And so part of the hope was, if we establish this public defender system, where the government is providing attorneys and also could have some sort of check on, right, how attorneys are operating and making sure that they're abiding by reputable practices, then hopefully we could provide justice not just to poor people. And some people, I will say, in reading the book, it seemed like these are people who are really on the sort of the radical side of thinking about public defenders. Some of them were advocating for the idea that we should give public defenders to rich people too, because then there would be less of an incentive, right, of private attorneys coming in and sort of doing good things for their paying clients and then not so great things for their non-paid clients. And so if everyone goes through the system having a public attorney, then they're getting literally the same kind of justice structurally.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And I am curious too about the case. I wrote it down here. So I don't Gideon versus Wainwright. So that was when it was first established that it was required for states to have public defenders. But before that, you talked about how they were really rare in the 1950s. How did we get from that point when they were rare and kind of the beginning of an idea to the point where the Supreme Court actually ruled that states had to appoint public defenders?
Yeah, so one of the fascinating things about Sarah Mayu's book in particular, and also other work that's looked at the history of public defense, but I think Mayu's book in particular really drives this point home, is the idea that we cannot understand the emergence of public defenders and just indigent defense provision more generally outside of the public defender system in particular without understanding concerns among liberals. So this could be sort of elites, really Republicans and Democrats at the time, who sort of consider themselves moderate, sort of investing in liberal democracy, right? And we're worried about increasing fears of communism in the United States. And we're using and thought that maybe if we provide public defense, this is sort of our commitment to democratic ideals and values. And it's also sort of the symbolic commitment of, hey, look, in the Soviet Union, you see and hear these stories of these show trials and people don't get real justice. But in the United States, we care a lot about providing real justice. We give even the poorest among us, right, paid attorneys. And so it was really sort of we could read it sort of with negative intention, but some people actually did want to provide public defense, right? But it was a story of it led to an opening where people who were much more on the progressive side, but then also moderates, could sort of get on the same page of, oh, actually providing indigent defense could be something that could allow us to commit to liberal democratic values, and also for progressives, help poor people.
So progressives kind of saw an opening in the American exceptionalistic view, or exceptionalists, I should say, not view that we're so much better than other countries. We're so much better than the Soviet Union. We actually care about justice. So that is really interesting, and it shows how many of our norms that we take for granted in the current times sprung out of the Red Scare and just weird moments in history like that create institutions. So you open your piece talking about George Floyd, obviously one of the most important moments in racial justice history here, and how he, in 2004, was convicted of a drug-related offense, but it seems like the cop or the prosecutor, I think it was the cop, right, who arrested him, had a really shady past. Can you connect that to your piece and also just talk about that story, bring it home to kind of the watershed moment of the Black Lives Matter movement this year?
Yeah, definitely. So, it was the detective in Houston who, the public defender's office down in Houston is really working on trying to figure out all of the cases that this detective was fabricating evidence in. And George Floyd's case was one of those possible cases. And so for me, I opened the piece that way because I think what's happening right now in the Black Lives Movement and the radical potential that we have to really shift the way we do a lot of things in this country that will have implications for policing and prisons. But beyond that, sort of the way we're dealing with the pandemic and just rebuilding a robust welfare state that actually never existed in the United States. And I think that this potential moment is really important to also recognize the unique contribution that the court process in particular has to racialized forms of social control. And so I open talking about George Floyd because I really wanted people to think, of course, I know about George Floyd because of those 8 minutes where his neck was under the knee of a white police officer and his death, but also in his life, he was controlled by the court process, carceral tools and techniques and systems that are broader than just that police incident. And so in talking about sort of the fabrication of evidence, the prosecutor's office is not checking, right, and really sort of making sure that they're doing their due diligence to make sure that frivolous charges aren't being brought, or that police who are known to, fabricate evidence aren't allowed to testify. That's really a problem, and that's a problem of the court system. And so that's sort of why I opened up the piece talking about, let's think about the life that George Floyd led, and how even in that life he was being controlled by punitive systems of social control.
Well, I love that because it's a more holistic view. And I think you took a more holistic view in your piece where you kind of bookended talking about prosecution, the criminal justice system, and then, talked a lot about public defenders and their role. But I want to, max out a little bit and talk about prosecution and how you made this great point about how punitive measures for police who murder or brutalize Black people most frequently, how that's almost a part of the same wheel, the same messed up system that we're dealing with. And I never thought of it that way, but it is an example of thinking small. And I wanted to know if you could expand upon that.
Yeah. So, I think the Black Lives Movement has been really wonderful, especially sort of the more progressive side, increasingly that has moved to the center, and thinking about what does abolition mean, right? What do we mean by we need to get rid of these punitive systems of social control? And part of that means that we need to have a more humane way of thinking about accountability. And so this applies not just to the least of us, so Black people, Latinx people, poor people who are routinely pulled into the system, but also thinking about even how do we deal with other types of harm, state-sanctioned harm through the guise of an individual level police officer, right? How do we think about accountability there? Do we want to prosecute that police officer, or is that only legitimating a system that exists and that we know on average and on net is more coercive toward marginalized communities? And so thinking about how alternative ways of holding those people accountable as well when they commit harm, not involving policing, prosecuting, and also incarcerating police officers, is part of that conversation. And it's a hard conversation to have, and not everyone's there. Oftentimes after these events, the first thing is to demand justice through the courts, prosecute the police officer. But first of all, that rarely ever results. First, the prosecution rarely happens, but then,
prosecutors are largely friends with, or oftentimes in bed
right.
with the police, because they're
Exactly.
one and the same.
Right, exactly. And so there's this institutional dynamic, and Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve's work talks a lot about this institutional dynamic where police and prosecutors really are, as you said, sort of one and the same, if you will, and they depend on each other. But so rarely does the prosecution happen, but then even after that, rarely is there conviction, and that's because of this sort of court-created scaffolding in law. Of dealing with and thinking about how the Fourth Amendment allows police officers to engage in many forms of things that the average citizen would consider abuse or violations of search and seizure.
So how do we get the public there? I know this may not be, your area, but to me, I understand the calls for justice, and I understand the anger when a police officer gets off. Tamir Rice is the example that sticks out in my mind forever as the most gut-wrenching example of this injustice. But how do you change that conversation? And I know it could be decades until people are okay with, okay, we need to even your principles aren't tested when it's an easy case, kind of what you were saying. They're tested when it's a hard case, like an abusive police officer. So how do you change the framework of the conversation to get to that point?
Right. I think part of it is a moral argument about how we want to treat people. But I think another part of it is a really just sort of strategic material argument of, hey, at the end of the day, is pulling that police officer through the system and then incarcerating them for a short period of time, what are they going to be like when they come out of that, right? What's someone who harms or murders going to be like after they come out of being incarcerated for a period of time? Are they going to be better people? Are they going to be flourishing people? Are they going to contribute to our society? Probably not. They won't have recognized the harm that they caused. They won't have gone through the methods of accountability and repair and restoration that's needed to bring them back into the community, because our process is so adversarial. It's just not set up to make people restore the harm that they caused in the community. And so I think that's part of the argument, is thinking, okay, is this sort of form of like, we got this police officer and we're pulling them into the system and we're prosecuting as you know, many in our communities are being prosecuted, which we're arguing is harmful, right? Is that form of harm actually going to make up for the loss of life that this police officer took from us? It's not. It's not going to lead to closure and restoration. And so thinking of alternative methods. And so there's a lot of work in the restorative justice space, Daniel Sered's work, and so many other people, Fania Davis and others who are working in this restorative justice space that really have pushed the imagination there with what we can do to produce accountability and restore communities.
Matthew Clair, assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University and the author of Privilege and Punishment: How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court, and of course the author of this Nation piece, How Did We End Up with Our Current Public Defender System? So I encourage everyone to read it. We'll link to it. Thank you so much, Matthew, for your time.
Thanks for having me.